All right, everybody. Thank you for being here on another Zoom call. Our guest today is Ross Douthat, who needs no introduction anywhere in the civilized world. He's a New York Times columnist and the author of a great new book, The Decadent Society: How We Became the Victims of Our Own Success. If you haven't gotten the book already, definitely pick it up. Ross Douthat, welcome to the news. Ross Douthat.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you now.
Okay, great.
Yeah. I should say welcome back. You talked about your book. We met in the Daily Caller offices many years ago.
Right. Many years ago.
When Bad Religion came out. So good to have you back.
A totally different America. A slightly different Daily Caller.
Not a totally different Tucker Carlson. People don't realize he's been a populist a lot longer than they know, but
that's true. But was that was around the time though when he gave that famous speech arguing that conservative journalists needed to imitate the New York Times and learn from the New York Times, which I don't think he would give that speech anymore.
He got booed.
I'm not sure. He did. Yep.
Well, thank you for being here. I want to open up. I'm going to just ask you spend a little time on this book, which I really enjoyed, and I've been listening to some of your other interviews about it, and I want to skip. Like I heard you and Bob Wright from Blockbeats had a long discussion. I'm going to skip that stuff and ask you some different things. You know, people hear decadence and they think of like Roman orgies and conspicuous consumption. You have a little bit of a different definition, but you quote somebody, and I want to read this quote because it's so good. It says, "When people accept futility and the absurd as normal, the culture is decadent." I mean, there could be no better definition of our current days than that.
Yeah, so I'm using decadence to basically mean a sort of a period of, as you just said, sort of futility, stagnation, and drift and repetition that only really happens at a really high level of civilizational advancement or development. So you have to be a really successful country or civilization or empire in the first place to become decadent. And once you do, you know, it can involve orgies and chocolate dipped strawberries and all the things that we sort of associate with decadence in the Las Vegas or Nero's Rome sense of the word. But mostly, at least in my argument, my definition, it just means this sort of sense of being stuck, going in circles in your arguments, failing to have new frontiers to explore. I spent a certain amount of time talking wistfully about the lost space age. And it also just means a kind of stagnation in economics, in demography. People start having fewer children, the world gets older. And then the question becomes, can you get out of it? Can you get out of decadence without having a civilizational collapse happen to you first?
And I said, as I noted, you and Robert Wright had this big sort of debate on Blogging Heads about what, because, you know, part of your argument is that our culture has sort of stagnated and our technology isn't as impressive, you know, and I think Bob Wright was sort of arguing, what are you talking about? We've got the internet, we've got the iPhone.
We've got Blogging Heads, you know.
Yeah, we're doing it. We're doing a Zoom right now. Come on, right. This is proof you're wrong. But you know, to illustrate the point that you make, you had this. You talk about this thought experiment about giving up indoor plumbing. I found it really resonated. If you remembered, I'd love to hear you put it in your own words.
Sure. I mean, like most things in the book, it's stolen from someone smarter than I am. But, you know, there's this famous economist or economic historian, Robert Gordon at Northwestern, who wrote a really long book called The Rise and Fall of American Growth. That is an amazing read if you want to read a really, really long book. If not, you can just read the capsule summary in my book. But he brings this point up because he's one of these guys who you could call stagnationists. He's people who argue that basically since the 1970s, both growth rates and technological innovation has been pretty disappointing in the Western world. Tyler Cowen is another one, Peter Thiel. And Gordon's thought experiment is basically, would you rather give up, you know, one of the inventions or even all of the inventions that we've experienced in the last 20 or 30 years, so digital technology in all its forms, versus one of the key innovations of the period from, let's say, 1840 to 1960. And so that would mean giving up indoor plumbing, or it would mean giving up penicillin, or it would mean giving up the automobile, or it would mean giving up airplanes. And his claim, which I think is probably true, is that in most of the audiences that he talks to, people are, as much as they may love their iPhone, willing to give it up in order to keep the great innovations of that previous period. And he uses this to argue basically that innovation hasn't stopped. Obviously, information technology is a sort of incredible zone, or has been an incredible zone of change and innovation over the last generation or two. But Gordon's claim is that innovation has narrowed, that basically if you go back to the first half of the 20th century or the last half of the 19th, you had innovation happening in like 6 to 16 different fields at once. You had, medical innovation happening on top of innovation in transportation, all across a range of energy innovation. And that since the 70s, we've become basically all tech and nothing else. So if you're an innovator, you're in Silicon Valley, and otherwise, nobody's space innovation sort of disappeared for a while until Elon Musk tried to bring it back. Energy innovation has chronically disappointed ever since we were supposed to be driving electric cars or have self-driving cars decades ago. And we've just ended up with the iPhone as like the great jewel of innovation, which would have been disappointing, he argues, I think rightly, to people in 1955 or so who were expecting to have, atomic powered vehicles, right, in their garage. If you go and read like the sci-fi of Isaac Asimov, or one of these golden age of sci-fi writers, it's striking. They do sometimes underestimate what we would be able to do with computers and communication, but everything else they're overestimating: space travel, robots, atomic energy being useful for everyday life. None of those things have come to pass.
1.21 gigawatts. I love
one of the things you're I see that maybe you haven't had a haircut that much in quarantine. For a while, I've gone bald up here, but my hair grows out like this so that I could create, if I wanted to, the Donald Trump comb over. But for a while I had the 1.21 gigawatts hair in quarantine. The Christopher Lloyd look. Yeah.
Well, you mentioned
time travel being another area where we've been totally let down.
I know, man.
There's a dearth of time travel breakthroughs. Back to the Future lied to us.
You mentioned they were right about the Cubs, but otherwise.
That's right.
You mentioned outer space. It plays a big role in your analysis about sort of proving our decadence. Why is space exploration, in your view, so important or telling?
Well, I think it's particularly important for our kind of civilization, right? So, the entire story of the modern West and the story of the United States has been a story of societies that are, sort of deliberately dynamic and innovative and sort of anti-traditional in various ways. Not that sort of traditions don't persist in these societies, but there's the sense that sort of novelty and innovation and transformation are part of the point of human life. And linked to that is exploration, right? The idea that there are supposed to be new frontiers to explore, new places to go. And that's obviously led to various wicked deeds over the course of Western history. And, we're having the great debates about Columbus statues right now as a reminder of those arguments. But it's, in terms of sort of the vitality and dynamism of Western society, the ability to, sort of literally go out from your country or your city and go to a new place and sort of find new things has been really, really important economically, important politically. It's a great thing for, spare elites to do, right? People who are highly educated or have a lot of money or have a famous name and don't really have great economic prospects at home can go off and sort of, head for the frontier, go west and so on. And it's been important, I think, intellectually in creating sort of a mood of possibility, a sense that, there really are new secrets always out there to be discovered. And so Frederick Jackson Turner, who was this early 20th century historian, wrote this famous essay about the idea of the frontier in American history, where he argued that the closing of the frontier, the Western frontier, something that had happened just before he wrote the essay, was this sort of epical moment in American history where suddenly something that had been central to the American way of life wasn't there anymore. But of course, no sooner did the Western frontier close than you had the beginnings. You had Kitty Hawk, right? You had flight, and from Kitty Hawk to the moon landing is basically it's 3 generations. It's an incredibly short amount of time, and so we had this period, which I don't think coincidentally sort of happened at the same time as sort of a peak of confidence and vigor in mid-century American civilization, where it seemed like the story of exploration and discovery was just going to continue. And, whether it was in the form of Star Trek or something else, we were going to, recapitulate the age of discovery in the stars. And when that didn't happen, when it turned out that space was too big and cold and our technology was too limited and we didn't have a way to get somewhere worth getting, I think it had all kinds of sort of maybe underanalyzed effects on society in terms of sort of constraining people's sense of what's possible, creating a sense of, that we're sort of all stuck here on Earth, just waiting for an apocalypse to come along and wipe us out. So you have sort of the turn to the apocalyptic in movies not long after the space age peters out. And I think it sort of haunts our present civilization. I think that's the line I use in the book, that we don't have a place to go exploring anymore, and there's a sense that sort of man's capacities have reached some kind of limit, and we're waiting for some breakthrough to carry us further. And in the meantime, we're sort of sitting around worried that disaster is going to overtake us instead.
And with no new worlds to conquer, you argue that video games, social media, VR, and porn allow us to safely cosplay indoors. This form of decadence, in a Brave New World fashion, actually has some positive externalities. Does that make decadence more alluring or tolerable or enduring?
It makes it more sustainable, I think, that that the one area of technology where we have innovated is an area that then becomes sort of an outlet for people's discontents. So you get, this is not totally provable, but there does seem to be some way in which violent video games or immersive pornography end up as substitutes or sort of outlets for especially male aggression that otherwise, would be doing destructive things in the real world. And so I think if you expand that outward to encompass the whole experience of the internet, I think there are a lot of ways in which, virtual reality is a kind of stabilizer for a decadent society, that people don't have new worlds to conquer, but they do have great video games to play. And the problem is, though, that this then creates feedback loops that sort of push you deeper into decadence, right? So as pornography takes over, men and women have more and more trouble relating to each other. So people are less likely to get married and have fewer kids. So society gets older and grayer and more sterile, and sort of slides. It's sort of a low fertility trap that you slide deeper and deeper into. But I think this is the big shift from the space age to the information age, is a shift from trying to get to the moon or Mars to creating really, really impressive simulations of what it might be like to get to the moon or Mars or somewhere else.
All right. And then my last question on the book, and then we're going to turn to some more current events questions. But you make the point that decadence doesn't necessarily mean the end, that other nations, that nations like ours could bounce back, but also that there's no proof that other nations are going to supplant us, because they actually may themselves experience their own decadence. And so we could end up having essentially a scenario where America would remain the dominant country because everyone's facing decadence. How likely is that fate for them, and what do you think that looks like?
Well, so I mean, first of all, I should stipulate that obviously this book was written and came out before the great coronavirus experience transformed at least the next year of our lives. And it has to be said that I think American power looks more fragile today than it did 6 months ago, even when I was finishing and starting to promote the book. And I think it's plausible to look at the current situation and say, okay, Ross was right about decadence, but maybe it's less sustainable than he projected, because all you need is a pandemic to come along and suddenly,
Let me just say, though, there are a couple of times in the book where you reference the potential for a pandemic.
Oh yeah, no. I mean, look, I still believe in my own prescience, but when I read those sentences now, I think, I really should have made that a paragraph instead of a sentence, right? But yeah, no, I mean, the book tries to consider the various catastrophes and apocalypses that could sort of bring decadence down, and what we're going through is sort of, I think, not the ultimate apocalypse, but sort of a foretaste of what that could look like. So in certain ways, I think America looks weaker today and more vulnerable to its own internal contradictions than I would have said 6 months ago. But at the same time, right, I think there are still ways in which the sense that other powers could be overtaking us could be kind of illusions, right? So right now, there's an assumption that what we're seeing from China, a virus breaks out in China, it ruthlessly suppresses it more successfully than we did, and then as the rest of the world falls into chaos, it starts flexing its muscles, picking fights with India, clamping down on Hong Kong. A lot of people look at that and say, okay, this is sort of a foretaste of the next 50 years. China's just going to get more and more powerful, and eventually they'll be the world's superpower and we'll be a second fiddle. But the other possibility is that actually China's power might be maxing out right now, because China does have some of the same decadence-related problems that we do. It has a terrible demographics, in part because of their one-child policy, in part just because of this convergence in aging of wealthy societies. And right now, China seems to be aging faster than it's growing. So it seems like its growth may start to stall before it gets as rich as Japan or South Korea or us. And some of the internal repression in China is actually an attempt to sort of deal with that by trying to suppress birth rates among ethnic minorities, boost birth rates against Han Chinese. There's an article by Lyman Stone, I think, in Foreign Policy just out that I was just looking at before this call about this. So China sort of, it has certainly more power than it did 20 years ago, but it has its own internal contradictions. It has its own forms of decadence. Certainly, it's not clear that its institutions are, built to last another couple generations. So I think it's still possible that, in spite of America's weaknesses and sort of internal problems, our rivals are fundamentally weaker than we sometimes think. And certainly if you look beyond China, right? Like if you look at, where is the coronavirus been really terrible? Like the Islamic Republic of Iran, right? Like sort of our main Middle Eastern enemy doesn't look like it's poised to take over the Middle East anytime soon. A lot of countries in the European Union have handled the pandemic badly, or did for a while. So it's not, the US has some distinctive problems, but the rest of the world, it's hard to look around the world and see, okay, here are the three rival empires that are just poised to leave us in the dust. I think there's more convergence and decadence than people sometimes expect.
All right. So I, again, want to recommend the book. I hope everyone who listens to this, who is watching us, will get it. It's called The Decadent Society. And now I'd love to turn to my friend and colleague, Bill Scher, who's out with a column today in the Washington Post, to ask Ross some questions that are not related to the book, maybe some current event stuff. And then we're going to open it up to anybody who's joining us on Zoom. And by the way, let me just say, if you support either Matt Lewis or Bill Scher on Patreon, you would have been invited to this Zoom call where you could talk to us and New York Times columnist Ross Douthat. Bill Scher, take it away.
Hey,
Well,
Bill.
I have two, maybe three questions to ask. Can I take three, Matt?
You go for it, man.
Good time for three.
We're doing
So
good on
I want to
time.
ask you about my column. I want to ask you about your column today, and I want to ask you about a third thing that relates to columns you've written in the past. So my column today in the Post argues that conservatives who made the Faustian bargain, I will swallow Trump's ideological transgressions because I know I'm going to get reliably conservative judges. That deal doesn't look like such a great deal at this point, and that's not simply because Roberts sided with the liberals on this recent abortion case. It's not because just because Gorsuch ruled with the liberals on transgender rights. We also look at the lower court situation, which a lot of folks for 3+ years have been saying, wow, look at the fast clip Trump has been confirming judges. He had his 200th judge last week, but he might top out at, say, 242 if all goes super well, because he's got 44 judges in the pipeline, lower court judges. But if he loses, Barack Obama had 327, Bush had 326, Clinton had more than 370. The whole system is designed for one party to not have full control over the judiciary. The pendulum's always going to swing. So, and the Supreme Court itself is designed by the founders because of the lifetime appointment to be resistant of political pressure. So it seems like a very elusive goal that isn't worth sacrificing so many core convictions. I'm curious what you think about that, or other conservatives that you talk to, what they think about that.
I mean, that has been, I was part of the crucial world-altering faction known as Never Trump, right, back in 2016, and that was basically my view at that point, right, that the control of the federal judiciary is extremely important, but that to elect someone who seemed unfit for the presidency exposed you to sort of longer range political risks, independent of the problem of having him actually be president, right? That could easily cost you more in the long run than you would gain in the short run. And I'm glad I saw in your column you mentioned Jimmy Carter, right? Because this is something I've brought up in these arguments before, right? Jimmy Carter is the answer to the trivia question: who was the last president to appoint as many judges in his first term as Donald Trump, right? And nobody looks back on the late 70s and says, man, well, Jimmy Carter, he really ensured that liberalism would control America for the next.
They passed a law in '78 to expand the courts. That's why he was able to run up the score. And there are conservatives that called that a form of court packing. But of course, Reagan, they passed another law under Reagan, and they expanded more judges, and he got more judges after that. So these things always tend to balance out.
Well, and they also like, what conservatives remember, I think rightly, is that some of Reagan's Supreme Court appointees let them down, right? But in the end, Sandra Day O'Connor and Anthony Kennedy were much more important to the future of American jurisprudence than all of Carter's lower court appointees. And in the same way, the fact that, you have in Roberts a Chief Justice who clearly makes strong political calculations in deciding when to side with the liberal bloc on the court. And you have in Neil Gorsuch a justice who has demonstrated that he, in his own textualist way, wants to play Anthony Kennedy and basically solve our culture war debates for us. It just, it shows you the limits of making the kind of gamble that conservatives made in 2016. And I have some, I think that that there's some wisdom for conservatives in seeing the way that Roberts rules and the way that Gorsuch rules and seeing the court in more political terms. I think conservatives have spent so much time sort of focused on the idea that if you just have the right philosophy, whether it's originalism or textualism, you'll get the outcomes that you want. And the court has always been much more political than that and will always remain more political than that. And, like John Roberts, I really think would probably have ruled a different way in the abortion case if Donald Trump were not president and like I think Roberts is a deeply calculating figure who thinks to himself, if I'm going to cast a vote that seems to chip away or do away with Roe v. Wade, I want to do it at a time when there's a popular Republican president in office rather than a sort of failing Republican administration. Now, that's obviously not the way conservatives think Supreme Court justices should make rulings, but it's the kind of thing that I think is inescapable. And again, you have to think about that when you're making calculations on whether you support, a given nominee for president in a given year.
So I want to ask you about your column today about Woodrow Wilson. A lot of the DMZ fans and regulars on our Zoom calls know I will die on the Woodrow Wilson hill, probably more so than anybody.
Doom, doom, doom.
And I'm not somebody who generally, if private institutions want to take names off of buildings and take down monuments, I generally don't care. That's their business. I feel Princeton and Wilson is kind of a unique example because Wilson is so identified with Princeton. The whole as you pointed out in your column, the public policy school is designed to be a Wilsonian school. And so if Princeton can't defend the Wilson legacy, well, who's left to do it? But I'm curious, for someone who, like a number of conservatives, Glenn Beck, Jonah Goldberg, there's been a lot of Wilson hatred in kind of the intellectual right for a long time. It would seem like
David Petrugia.
It would seem like this is a chance to spike the football. We've successfully torn down the legacy of Wilson and reduced him to being little more than a racist. Why aren't you doing a victory lap?
I mean, I think, well, one, I probably don't hate Woodrow Wilson as much as Glenn Beck and Jonah Goldberg. Like there's no conceivable way you can match that level of white hot hatred. So
you might be on a Petrugia level.
So the Petrugia level was a little known Robert Ludlum thriller that came out in the 1980s. But yeah, I mean, I think that I get, so the argument that I made in the column is that the act of taking down a monument or taking down a name or something is an act of where you are effectively repudiating the inheritance from the person who you are sort of demonumentalizing, whatever term you want to use. And so it might be appropriate in the case of Confederate memorials, because in most of those cases, we don't think there's a sort of inheritance from Nathan Bedford Forrest, right, that we still treasure to the present day. And you're sort of, if you're taking down Confederate memorials, you're effectively saying there was nothing in the Confederacy that we still owe some kind of debt to in the present. And that's right. Wilson, though, is different. In this case, Princeton is not repudiating the Wilson legacy; it's repudiating one particular piece of it, right? The fact that he was a racist who sort of made Jim Crow worse. And from the point of view, I think even from like the Beck Goldberg point of view, that's not spiking the football. It's getting rid of like the most noxious part of the Wilson legacy, but it's not getting rid of any of the other stuff. It's not repudiating any of the other stuff that he is remembered for, that made him a really consequential president. It's not Princeton is not repudiating Wilsonian idealism in foreign policy. It's not repudiating the administrative state that he helped construct. It's not repudiating his theories of presidential power. It's only repudiating his racism. And if it had been the Woodrow Wilson School of Race Relations, then I think taking his name off it would have made sense, because if it was like memorializing him as some great friend to African Americans, then by all means take his name off. But in this case, you're basically saying, we still like the guy's legacy. We're continuing the guy's legacy. We're just going to pretend it doesn't come from him. And that seems to me to be sort of historically dishonest in a way that's I think bad for American culture, bad for elite culture. It's bad to sort of sit in the present and declare that we are sort of maintaining an inheritance while, rejecting the people from whom we took the inheritance in the first place.
I actually look at it a little bit. I mean, I don't know exactly what's going to happen inside the walls of the formerly Woodrow Wilson School. It would just seem to me that, the Wilson legacy was already kind of, dying on the vine. He's not the average person doesn't know that well how much he made America an international power. They don't know how much he has to do with the foundations of the New Deal and having the vision for the United Nations and all that sort of thing. But it seems to me if you're not going to, by taking the name down from Princeton, you're basically saying the most important part of this man's legacy is his racism. And for a lot of people, once you hear X historical figure was a racist, like that's the end of your interest in that person.
Yep.
And you don't really go much deeper than that. And like, who cares about hurting Wilson's feelings? He's dead. That's not what's really relevant here. The question is, are we going to understand our own American story? Are we going to understand how America became to be an international power, and whether that was good or bad? Are we going to understand how the administrative state was created? Are we going to understand how race relations and how America's interest in racial equality continued to decline over time after Reconstruction, which does not start and end with Woodrow Wilson? There's a lot of other stuff that happens around that. So that's the part that sort of worries me, that this is actually this enormously consequential point in history that is not terribly well understood and will now be even less understood because we won't really talk about the complexity of Wilson.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, I think that the sort of declaring people significant primarily because of their sins is a good way to make people either forget about them or just reduce them to those sins. And I think there's an aspect within American liberalism right now, not the only aspect, but an aspect that effectively wants to sort of keep moving forward the point at which you start the clock of sort of decency in history, right? So it's like, everything before X period is just sort of, capital B bad and terrible. And so we want to start our story in 1789. No, we want to start our story in 1860. No, we want to start our story in 1914. And now we're up to Franklin Roosevelt. And of course, Franklin Roosevelt did some terrible things too, right? I mean, if you can make a case for canceling Wilson, I don't think the case is as strong for Roosevelt, but the internment of the Japanese was in certain ways a more substantial race-related crime than what Wilson did. So, and there will be people who would say, well, you could cancel Roosevelt. And eventually you're reaching a point where the liberal narrative of American history just sort of starts in the 1960s, which is, how a lot of people...
You can cancel LBJ for the Vietnam War. I mean,
that too, right? Yeah.
There's no perfect person.
Right.
Speaking of the divisions on the left, that's the third thing I want to ask you about. I know it's been a periodic interest of yours in your columns, how diverse / fractured / balkanized the Democratic Party coalition is. And it's something that I've often written about too. But I feel, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but my sense from you is that you've always looked at the Democratic Party as a somewhat tenuous coalition that might not well be able to stay together. And I've tended to look at it as one that is a big tent with a moderate tilt that has a good chance of staying together, although there'll be obviously complications and tensions and difficulties along the way. And I'm wondering, how do you feel now about the state and the health of the Democratic Party and the progressive movement after seeing Biden survive the primary, after seeing Biden resist the defund the police push after the George Floyd protests, and with him seemingly in a very strong position for the general election? Does that make you think, hey, these guys are holding it together? Or do you think they may make it to January, but then things are going to get very, very nasty?
I mean, I think Biden definitely surprised me in his sort of ability to survive the factional infighting in the party. And I had written a column at the start of his campaign where I said, I thought he faced a choice, right, where the party had moved so much to his left that he would either have to run against the party's emerging consensus, defending his past record, in which case he could, I thought, maybe win but he would win while alienating a big swath of younger voters, especially in the party. Or he would spend all his time sort of doing some kind of apology tour, and pretending not to have held the positions he held, and would just sort of embarrass himself, and his campaign would fall apart. Obviously, neither of those things happened. He did move to the left on certain issues, to my disappointment on abortion, but he sort of resolutely resisted a lot of big symbolic moves leftward, fended off attacks successfully, like Kamala Harris's attack on busing issues, sort of wrapped himself in the flag of the Obama era whenever someone challenged him on race and crime, and got lucky, right? He got lucky that the rest of the party's battles played out the way they did. The left didn't unite. The other establishment candidates were sort of more factional and didn't have as much appeal to African Americans, but he came through, won resoundingly in the end, and now is 12 points ahead of Donald Trump. So all of that, I think, does tell you that there's a lot of ballast still in the Democratic Party among a lot of sort of moderation among voters who don't show up on Twitter, basically, and that some combination of the residual, white blue-collar union vote, middle-class Hispanics, middle and working-class African Americans, that's like the basis for a moderate Democratic Party that could probably pretty effectively govern the country. The challenge is that base is extremely underrepresented among the general American elite and the elite of, maybe to a lesser extent, but the elite of the Democratic Party. And so there is, I think, some tension there, especially on cultural issues, that a much more effective Republican Party would be able to exploit. In the absence of an effective Republican Party, though, it seems like I don't see any reason why Joe Biden's administration has to fall apart like in the first week necessarily. I think that, I don't think Biden has the solutions to the deep problems that afflict America. I think he is sort of an embodiment of the decadence that I'm describing in my book. He's sort of, the aging embodiment of a sort of, an establishment that struggles to solve the problems of today. But given where the country has ended up under Donald Trump, I would certainly rather be the Democrats than the Republicans right now, right? I mean, the challenge for the Republicans is the Republican Party has a more homogenous and therefore, in certain ways, a unified base than the Democrats do. Democrats are a much more ramshackle, diverse coalition that combines, upper middle class, woke white people and Hispanic men in ways that create challenges. I've compared the Democrats to sort of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the late 19th century. But the Republican Party's homogeneity has become a trap for it, where its leaders can't seem to figure out a way to reach out beyond that core. And as long as that's the case, the Austro-Hungarian Empire can continue to rule Central and Eastern Europe, right?
All right. We have gotten a few people chatting, saying they have questions, and the first is Todd. Todd, fire away.
Hey, Todd.
Hey, Ross. Thank you for being here. I was struck by your comments with Bob Wright and your interview with him or whatever, and blogging he has, in that you acknowledge that there were elements of dynamism inside overall decadence, and I think that you referenced the Mormon Church in the Antebellum era as an example of that, like something new. And I'm wondering if you think that, within the conservative movement right now, and maybe within the culture as a whole right now, if this push for religious liberty exceptions in the law constitutes dynamism. And I'm thinking like the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. I'm thinking of the Hosanna Tabor decision, the Trinity Lutheran decision, and even today's Espinosa decision as a really, I think, measurable movement by courts to give people with religious convictions sort of wiggle room in the law. And I think it also relates to like what Gorsuch did about, in his opinion about sex, in that he left a loophole for people with religious exceptions. So I'm wondering if you think that amounts to like dynamism in our current moment.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't call that dynamism at this point. I mean, I think sort of in a way, the invention of sort of religious liberty argumentation, mostly on the political right after the school prayer decisions, was genuinely dynamic, and we're sort of, in these cases, we're seeing the working out of that across several generations of lawsuits and arguments and so on. So it has there's dynamism in its origins. At this point, it's a pretty well established project, and I guess the way I would think of it is, if it works, it's creating space in which dynamism might flourish again, but it can't generate religious dynamism on its own. So yes, you are, in whatever compromise Gorsuch hashes out over the course of his next 6 decisions on this stuff, and, in this sort of larger trajectory of religious liberty victories, you are carving out some space where a serious Christian faith could potentially continue to thrive in culturally hostile conditions. But the actual arc of institutional Christianity over the period when these battles are being won is an arc of decline. And that's why I think a lot of conservative Christians sort of roll their eyes at like David French, right? When he writes one of his pieces saying, "Why are you guys so gloomy? We've been winning all these religious liberty cases." And people say, well, religious liberty is great, but if our churches are in decline and our cultural influence is collapsing, it feels like sort of a meaningless victory. And it's not a meaningless victory, but it's only a victory that sort of constructs space. It doesn't fill it, right? So the decision today does not revitalize the American Catholic school system. It creates a context in which maybe some combination of Catholic revival and wise conservative public policy could someday revive the Catholic school system, at which point we would look back and say, well, that decision was really helpful. But it doesn't, I guess I don't feel like it clears the threshold of, deep cultural dynamism so much as it sort of suggests that, well, if we ever got some dynamism, we have legal structures that could support it, if that makes sense.
We have a question from Aaron. Aaron, you have to take off your mute though.
Hey,
yeah,
Aaron.
thanks for taking time to talk to us, and thanks for letting me ask a question. So I know that one of the things you've mentioned as a possible way for us to get through this decadence is to experience, hopefully, a renaissance of sorts. And, the famed European Renaissance benefited greatly from a study of classical or Greco-Roman philosophy, as well as obviously Christian thought and science and other things. So I guess my question to you is, I've had a lot of personal growth as a result of participating in the renaissance of Stoicism and virtue ethics, just as a principled system in general. And I was wondering what you think are the promises and pitfalls of looking to the ancients for philosophical guidance.
So, I mean, I think the promises are that they have tons and tons of wisdom to a world completely alien. And so it's wisdom that we don't, most people don't have immediate access to, and therefore it offers maybe, sort of more dramatic forms of upside. And I'm sorry for sounding like a life coach here rather than a philosopher, but if you're picking up a tradition that is distant from your own culture and underexplored, you can sort of gain a lot from it in a relatively short time, I think, and also get a lot more perspective on the debates of your own society, right? Like it's really instructive to sort of step into the philosophical worlds of ancient Greece and Rome and recognize that, that so many assumptions that we take for granted in the modern West aren't necessarily human universals, and plenty of really intelligent people disagreed with them. So that's I think an obvious upside. I guess it's pitfalls. I mean, I think one challenge is that you want, if you're reaching back to the past for wisdom and insight and you're trying to bring it forward into the present, ultimately you need to find ways to sort of institutionalize that insight, which is, part of what happened in the Renaissance and afterward, was sort of attempts to institutionalize political insight, right, from the ancient world and so on. But when you think of like ancient philosophical schools, right now there aren't sort of, there aren't necessarily institutional forms. Maybe the university is supposed to be an institutional form, but it's not, in which you can sort of try and practice that wisdom and deepen your experience of that wisdom in a community in a way that then is transmissible to the younger generation. There isn't the equivalent of, Christian churches. Like, so if you're getting deep into medieval Christian wisdom, right, that's also from a world alien to ourselves, but then you can take that to a world of Christian churches that still, at least notionally, believe in it and sort of try and live it out in community. And I would imagine, maybe I'm underestimating sort of Stoic community right now, but I would imagine that's harder with, Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus and figures like that. And that, the danger is that you're operating more in solitude, though obviously that is itself kind of a stoical thing to do.
All right, I think we're going to go to Laura, Doug, and Chris, and then I'm guessing we will be out of time. Laura, what is your question?
Well, Ross, I've been reading your column since you started at the New York Times, and every time I read one about marriage, low fertility, things like that, I feel left out. I feel like people in my demographic, highly educated, liberal, but unmarried or married but unable to afford having children, are left out. We're not conservative. We're not, getting married young, going to church. We're not, watching too much porn maybe, and therefore like stuck in that feedback loop you talked about. We just want things that are seemingly normal yet unattainable for us. And where do we fit in your view?
I mean, so first of all, Laura, I don't know anything about your personal circumstances, so I don't want to make any. I don't. Right. Okay. I
just wonder, like, there are liberals out there who, are not part of this anti-marriage, anti-children.
No, I think that's right. I mean, look, I don't think, I guess my view of liberalism is less that there is sort of an overt anti-marriage, anti-children bias, and more that we've tended to set up societies that are sort of, that sort of assume that marriage and children and family take care of themselves, right? Because people want to get married, people want to have kids. And so of course they'll always be able to get married and have kids, and you don't need to sort of organize society in any particular way to make that happen. So it's not that, I mean, while there are, certain writers for, left-wing publications who want to abolish the family and things like that, I don't think that's the dominant strain in liberalism at all. I think the dominant strain is, marriage and childbearing will sort of take care of themselves.
But they won't.
Right. Well, no, I don't.
My friend who can't afford childcare, like these things are not taking care of themselves.
Yes, I agree. I mean, and I think there are politicians who, and this is not just not conservative and not liberal, on both sides of the aisle, who take those kind of problems seriously. The cost of raising kids, the fact that the cost of everything gets cheaper, but the time it takes to take care of a new baby doesn't, there's no labor-saving device that gets you through the first 2 months of a baby's life. And I think there are people who take that seriously. And if you had, a family policy system designed by, Marco Rubio and Michael Bennet, the Democrat from Colorado, you would get to a much better place of family affordability than we have right now. The challenge is that as societies get older and have fewer kids, people who want to be parents or people who are new parents end up having less political power, and so those issues don't get the same level of attention, right? So debates about Medicare take up much more political energy than debates about helping people who want to get married and have kids, in part because the constituency for Medicare just gets bigger and bigger every year. So I've been writing about family policy for 10 or 15 years, and I'm always frustrated by the gap between getting politicians to embrace ideas, which you can do, and getting the political system to act on them, which seems to be a lot harder. But then the other dynamic is that even in countries that do spend a lot more money on helping parents, like, Scandinavia, you have some of the same declines in marriage, child rearing, even people having sex. People have less sex in Sweden than they did 20 years ago. Strange but true. And that's where I sort of put on my cultural conservative cap and think that there's some sort of breakdown in the culture that sort of makes people capable of getting married, like that creates a good pool of marriageable men and, teaches the sexes how to relate to one another. And some of that has an economic component too. You need, especially working class men, to have better jobs sometimes than they do. But like, if I look at my friend group, right, like my male friend group from college, which is mostly not culturally conservative, you just have a lot of drift. Well-educated men, who, have good economic prospects and who, they'll date a woman for 4 or 5 years and there's no sense of urgency, and then they'll break up, and then before you know it, we're all 40 and half of my eligible male friends haven't been married, which is a very strange world to end up in. And there's no like one size fits all solution, but there does seem to be a lot of sort of drift without urgency in male behavior across the period from like 23 to 45.
Ross, let me exercise a point of privilege here and just follow up on that, because I think this has been one of the more interesting parts of our discussion. And then I want to finish with Doug and Chris. But just to put a finer point on this, when you talk about things like the declining birth rate, you're not criticizing liberals or modern Americans, right? You are essentially saying that people are acting rationally. We are responding to incentives, and those incentives are to wait longer to get married and have fewer kids, and spend more time online and less time at the bar. Is that right?
Well, yes, and I would say nothing has made me feel more sympathy for the decadent Europeans who just want to go to brunch than actually having kids, right? It was a lot easier to be a pronatalist before I saw what having kids was actually like. But no, there is a little bit of blame. I guess I'd put it this way: I don't blame anyone who hasn't been able to meet the right person or make their relationship work for not, just sucking it up and marrying Mr. Wrong and having kids. Like that would be, that would be crazy to lay blame that way. I do think though that sort of the upper middle class family that has 2 kids and could afford to have a 3rd kid, but, feels like they want to prioritize a set of, taking vacations and making sure their 2 kids sort of maintain their particular rung in the meritocracy. I think there's a little bit of moral failure there. I think that there are a lot of families in America that really struggle with the cost of having children. There are also families in America, though, that probably, and in Europe and other developed countries, that probably could have more kids than they do and should. So I'm not going to strip away the judgment entirely. And this extends to, my wife and I probably could have had more kids if we'd made different choices ourselves.
Come on,
so
Ross, you could have 7 or 8.
I'm not exempting. Well, this is the fun thing about being the conservative Catholic columnist for the New York Times is I move back and forth between liberal worlds where our family seems insanely large, and Catholic world is where we're like a tiny family.
Tim Carney laughs at you.
Tim Carney like would rent us a baby. Just
He laughs at the
yeah.
Douthat clan. I'm afraid, I think we may, we're going to lose Bill Scherer shortly. He has to go to a meeting. Bill, thank you for.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bill.
Sorry, I as I just said in chat, being a natalist, I have to set up a virtual pediatrician appointment right now. So
It's very admirable, Bill. I approve.
Bill Scherer lives a more conservative lifestyle than I do. Let's see, 2 more questions, and then I guess we got to roll. Let's go to Doug. Doug,
so you're good. So I would change what I wrote in the chat. I think there more interesting thing is to point out Brian Kaplan's book, Selfish Reasons to Have More Kids. It basically argues that it's not cost of kids. People are investing too much of their own time and money in their kid, and you can do it a lot easier. You can make of it what you will, but it's out there. I think it's worthwhile perspective. Secondly, wanted to get your thoughts on, a couple of years ago, I heard David Brooks say that in the current environment, we're ripe for another religious revival. I've heard John McWhorter comment quite persuasively that the new anti-racism has a lot of aspects of a religion to it. And my question is the new anti-racism moment the religious revival that David Brooks thought we might get, just in a completely different form than anyone might have expected?
Yeah, maybe so. I mean, I think it certainly partakes of some of the energies that he was probably describing, that sort of, you could argue that there's like a sort of quantum of religiosity in any society. And if your religious institutions are failing to capture it, it will get captured somewhere else. And one, I haven't written this as a column, but one thing I've been thinking about is, you can think of modern American history as basically different attempts to fill the void left by the decline of mainline Protestantism, right? That there was sort of this powerful network of Protestant churches that were sort of close to the heart of American liberal democracy. Even though we didn't have an official established church or a state religion, they still played this incredibly important role in our society. And as institutions, they sort of fell apart in the 60s and 70s. And then there was this period when conservatives thought that the alliance of Catholics and evangelicals would basically fill that space, right? So in the George W. Bush's presidency, if you hung out around religious conservatives, there was this feeling that, we're the new main line. We're going to be the new sort of religious center of America. And that didn't take for a lot of reasons that are too long to go into. But I think you could read the current moment and for what's happening around anti-racism as a moment like that, this sort of mixture of different sort of identity politics causes are trying to create a sort of new moral language that could at least guide sort of, the Democratic Party and liberalism, but ideally sort of become the heir of the old Protestant mainline. And it's often I think, the descendants of mainline Protestants, right? Like sort of, spiritual but not religious young people are often literally the descendants a couple generations down of people who would have gone to a Methodist or a Presbyterian church in 1955. What's tricky is that it's sort of a morality without a metaphysics, right? Normally you would think of religion as combining a metaphysic with the morality. And you have sort of experiments in American society, in New Age, pantheism, witchcraft, and so on, that sometimes seem like a metaphysics without a clear morality. And then you have social justice as sort of a morality without a metaphysics. And if you could ever put all that together, maybe you would have a religious awakening in full. But right now it feels like more we have sort of pieces of it.
Yeah, and social justice is a pretty incomplete morality too, while you're at it. So
yeah, well, it doesn't connect. It's a self-contradictory morality too, right? Because it has sort of all these, each each group sort of ascends, and you'll have the Me Too moment when the demands of feminism are paramount, and then the Black Lives Matter moment when the demands of anti-racism are paramount. But it lacks a pope, to rule on how this all fits together in a catechism.
All right, and then I think our last question is going to have to come from Chris.
Yeah. So my question is, with what you call decadence, how much of that is simply the fact that we're in a post-agrarian society where very few people have a connection to agriculture anymore? We're not out on the farm working for kind of more basic sustenance like we have for most of human history. And is there kind of a way to avoid that without going back to, an agrarian economy or something like that?
I think that I guess I'd say that if you trace, we've certainly run out of sort of clear paths to further development. You had a transition from an agrarian to an industrial economy. And then that was sort of the central economic revolution of the last 200 years, from which a lot of what we think of as modernity comes from. And then you had the transformation from the industrial to the information economy, which I think the argument in my book is that's been less sweeping and dramatic than a lot of people believed and thought. But I think I guess this is part of why I spend a lot of time thinking about like space travel, right? Because it does seem like a society that reaches our current level of advancement on a single planet is maybe by definition going to end up in some sort of condition of stagnation. And in fact, there are economists and other figures who've written entire books making a similar argument to mine, but saying, and this is a good thing, right? We're just going to sort of, we've sort of transcended the Malthusian traps of the agrarian past. We can feed the world as long as we don't have too many kids. And, we can sort of avoid climate change as long as we don't grow too fast. We can restrain climate change and just sort of carry on sustaining things as they are. And I think that that's a sort of depressing perspective, because I think that kind of world will ultimately slide towards dystopia in various ways. But it definitely seems like the case that you need some other zone of sort of technological possibility than we've found to date to get out of where we've ended up.
All right. Well, this was a fascinating discussion. It covered a lot of territory. Thank you, Ross, for being here. Thank you, everybody. And if you're listening or watching and you want to be a part of these, you can support us on Patreon. This podcast, patreon.com/Matt Lewis, also patreon.com/Bill Scher. And please go get the book, The Decadent Society by Ross Douthat. Ross Douthat, thank you for coming back on the news.
Thank you so much, Matt. And thanks to everyone for really stimulating questions and discussion. I really appreciate it. This was a lot of fun. More fun than my average Zoom call these days.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. And Ross, really appreciate it.
All right. Be well, Matt.
You too, man. Thanks.
Best of luck.
See you guys.
Thanks, everybody.